Oh man, do I have a story for you. What do you get when you have 3 bodies, 4 decades, 12 fake identities, and 1 eccentric billionaire at the center of it all? You've got the makings of a great true crime documentary that just might end up putting the lead of your film behind bars. Here is the ridiculous story of Robert Durst. Robert Durst was born in New York to a family that owned a wealthy real estate company. After he graduated with his bachelor's degree in economics, he went to UCLA for grad school. There he met a woman named Susan, who just so happened to be the daughter of a really famous mobster. So Robert and Susan both came from these insanely wealthy Jewish families, so they probably bonded over rich people problems and other stuff like that. But even though the two sounded like they could be compatible AF, they were allegedly never romantic. Susan was commonly referred to Robert's longtime friend. Before finishing this degree, Robert withdrew from school and moved back to the East Coast to work for his family business. In the early 70s, he met a dental hygienist named Kathleen, who he married in 1973. According to Robert's friends, he started to complain in 1981 that his marriage was unraveling. Ooh, I already don't like where this is headed. One day, Kathleen ended up in the hospital with her face covered in bruises. She claimed her wounds were from Robert but didn't want to press charges. Now instead, Kathleen asked her abusive husband for a divorce, and after that, Robert canceled her credit card, took her off their joint bank account, and stopped paying her medical school tuition. 3 weeks later, on January 31st, 1982, Kathleen went missing. This was just a few months before she was supposed to graduate from medical school. And freaking Robert didn't report her as missing until 5 days later. Robert said the last time he saw Kathleen was when he dropped her off at a train station after she had spent the weekend with him. Now apparently, she was headed for Miami. But Robert's story of the last time he saw Kathleen changed a bunch of times as he told it to other people. First, he said he dropped her off at the station. Then, he started saying that she left his house in a cab, but all the while he never seemed to act too worried about her. Or, behave at all appropriately for someone whose wife had been missing for literally weeks. A few people claimed that they saw Kathleen in the city after her alleged train ride, but there were no real solid leads, and the case eventually went cold. But during the investigation, Susan, who was Robert's bestie from Cali, became his official spokesperson and helped advise Robert on how to handle himself legally. I mean, yeah, that makes sense. Susan was probably well versed on how to deal with law enforcement because her dad was a literal mob boss. All right, so this whole time Robert was working for his dad's real estate business in Manhattan, but so was his brother Douglas. Things weren't very civil between the two brothers as they clearly were gearing up for their dad to kick the bucket so one of them could take over. To be a mediocre white man born into privilege, that must be nice. The feud between Robert and Douglas was pretty intense. In the heat of all their drama, the two brothers both kept weapons hidden in their offices. Douglas kept a piece of pipe in his office. Robert kept a plumber's wrench in his. And Colonel Mustard had the candlestick in the ballroom. And Douglas was so out to get Robert that he installed a camera in his office. But it's a good thing that he did because the camera caught Robert flipping through a bunch of papers that he had no business looking at. Robert would also use his brother's and uncle's trash bins as a urinal. Well, in 1994, the boy's father passed the business baton down to Douglas, who was actually younger and more mentally stable than Robert. Naturally, Robert was super pissed about the whole thing, so he just hit the road. And at that point, Robert started bouncing around between New York, Texas, and California. He was one of those guys who just couldn't stay in one place for a long time and had a habit of picking and leaving town anytime the going got rough. Or, the time he became a suspect in a fatal crime again. In November of 2000, Robert got the news that Kathleen's missing person case was going to be reopened. A month after that, he secretly married a lady named Deborah. The ceremony was only 15 minutes. Now that's a wedding that I would want to attend. So Robert's new wife, Deborah, was the super wealthy real estate broker who also came from a wealthy Jewish family. But it seemed like the marriage was all just for clout because even though the two were married on paper, they didn't even live together. A lot of people thought that Deborah knew Robert's secrets, and by marrying him, she wouldn't have to testify against him. They also believed Deborah was after his money, and since they just got married, that meant she held his power of attorney and had access to the Durst family fortune. So Robert must have known that the cops were onto him because after hopping around cities, he vanished for a bit. Where did he go? A small island city along the Gulf of Texas called Galveston. There he rented a cheap-ass apartment and disguised himself as a mute woman. Robert actually used dozens of aliases and fake identities in his lifetime, and when detectives once searched his home, they found a scanner, laminator, and pretty much everything you would need to make a fake ID. It's confirmed that Robert has gone by at least 12 different aliases, but investigators assume he actually has many more than that. So a few days after Robert skipped town, the police got an anonymous letter saying that a cadaver would be found at Susan's address. That can't be good. When the cops went out to check on Susan in her Beverly Hills home, it was too late. She had already been executed. The police took note of the fact that the word Beverly was misspelled in the letter. Something else the cops realized that Susan was supposed to be interviewed for the newly reopened case surrounding the disappearance of Robert's ex-wife Kathleen. Ding, 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 ding. So now it definitely looked like someone was trying to hide something. We've got one man, 2 bodies, and 20 years of evading the police. You do the math, he's guilty. But let's go back to the whole mute woman thing. So while Robert lived in Texas, he disguised himself as a woman named Dorothy. He completely assumed the identity of this fake woman and would sometimes go as far as to show up at the house dressed as himself, pretending to be Dorothy's house guest named Durst. Is anyone else confused? Who is this man? Like, I'm starting to think that this guy's name wasn't even Robert. Robert's character Dorothy would frequent the clubs and gay bars, and since Robert did his makeup really over the top and heavy-handed, Dorothy seemed to fit right in with the drag scene. But even though the clubgoers thought Dorothy seemed to fit in, the actual drag queen's nickname Dorothy, the ugliest drag queen on the island. That had to hurt. So the whole thing about Dorothy being nonverbal was primarily due to the fact that Robert had a very loud and distinctive manly voice. He knew that if he talked too much as Dorothy, he would be found out. I feel like everyone was probably so taken back if Dorothy was labeled the ugliest drag queen on the island. Like, at that point, they were probably just looking at her, not listening. Well, in September of 2001, the island town was rocked when pieces of Dorothy / Robert's neighbor, 71-year-old Morris Black, started to wash ashore. Pieces? Holy cannoli, Batman! What could this 70-year-old man have possibly done to deserve such an awful fate? When the police first started investigating Morris's case, Robert wasn't even a thought in their mind. Searchers went to Morris's apartment complex to check things out and found a trail of red splatter leading to the neighboring unit, which belonged to a woman named Dorothy. At the time, officials didn't know Dorothy was actually Robert. The next thing we know, they're digging through the complex trash and find a receipt with Robert's name on it. No big deal, right? Well, the weapon used on Morris was registered the same Robert. Oh, that's a big deal. And the cops thought the same thing. After a bit of search, detectives were able to track down Robert and arrest him. At the time of his arrest, Robert was actually staying in a hotel under the name of Jim Truss. I don't trust that. I wasn't joking when I said he had at least a dozen aliases. Right after his arrest, Robert, being the wealthy man that he was, quickly posted bail and escaped to Pennsylvania. Can we put this man on a leash or something? We've learned by now that this man is a flight risk. So can we please keep an eye on him? A giant search for Robert began, and after 6 weeks of scouring, Robert was arrested for shoplifting at a supermarket. Because this guy just doesn't know how to quit. Also, it's definitely worth mentioning what it is that he was caught shoplifting, because it's honestly such a bizarre detail. So our fugitive millionaire was caught for trying to steal, wait for it, a $5 sandwich, a newspaper, and some Band-Aids. Yeah, and not Band-Aids, I mean one Band-Aid. After he cut his lip shaving, Robert decided it would be smart to walk up to the first aid aisle, grab a box of Band-Aids, and look the security guard right in the eye while removing one singular Band-Aid from the package. So when Robert was detained, he was wearing a plaid shirt, cargo pants, a ski parka, black shoes, and a woman's wig. Police also found $500 in cash tucked away in those sick cargo pockets. And at that point, investigators theorized that Robert only shoplifted because he wanted to get caught. So what does it mean when a man who has spent his entire life running from the police turns himself in? Had this kooky criminal finally come to his senses? Or was this all just part of his master plan? Robert was charged with the attack on Morris and was taken to trial. According to Robert, he came home to his apartment to find his 71-year-old neighbor, Morris, sitting on the couch watching television. Robert said he was friends with Morris, but he was confused to see him in his home. Okay, so did Robert leave his door unlocked or something? Because I don't think his little old man neighbor would just break in like that, right? Well, once Robert walked in to find his uninvited neighbor, he claimed that the dude slowly raised his hand and aimed the barrel of his weapon at Robert. Robert, in a panic, said he began to fight with Morris, who tripped and fell when the Glock accidentally fired right at Morris's head. Ah, the old, I dropped the .22 caliber and it just so happened to fire and do the thing I was secretly hoping it would do. Ha! Classic. After the accidental slaying, Robert said he realized what he had done. So at that point, he knew he needed to get rid of the evidence and hide the body. And at first, he thought about rolling it up in something and carrying it out the back side of the complex, but he realized it's too heavy and someone could potentially see him. So then he slowly and methodically began to chop. When he was done, he wrapped the pieces in garbage bag and tossed them into the Galveston Bay. Robert explained to the jury that he knew he couldn't call the police because they would look into him and see who he was, which would cause a bunch of suspicion. And yes, even though he was this billionaire guy who was getting all this attention in the news back home from his missing wife, he claimed he really was just misunderstood and would never intentionally harm anyone. Well, somehow the jury believed Robert's story and he was acquitted after claiming self-defense. What? However, he was found guilty for some minor charges and served 6 months in prison in 2005. As soon as he was released, he violated parole and spent another 26 days in jail. And in 2010, Robert agreed to sit down with these two filmmakers who wanted to make a documentary about his life story. In 2012, he followed up for a second interview. And when Robert met with the filmmakers the second time, he had a private moment off camera where he talked to himself but didn't realize the mic was still on, recording everything he was saying. Which is quite possibly one of the only times in history anyone has ever been ecstatic about the fact that old people don't understand how technology works. Robert said, and I quote, "What the hell did I do? Killed them all? Of course." However, it wouldn't be until 2 years later when the editors were sorting through the footage when this confession was found. And then the filmmakers got another piece of damning evidence. They found a letter written from Robert to Susan where the word Beverly was misspelled the exact same way it was in the letter that was sent to police 10 years ago. Well, stuff my shells and call me Sherlock. I think we just solved the case. The documentary was called The Jinx and it premiered on HBO in February of 2015. The night before the last episode aired in March 15th, a judge signed a warrant for Susan's case, and Robert was found and arrested in a Marriott hotel in New Orleans, where he checked in under a fake name, Everett Ward. Dude, this guy has a whole bunch of characters and he just switches around a lot. Robert had been tracked to the Marriott after making 2 phone calls on the hotel phone to check his voicemail. When the cops arrived, they spotted him wandering around the lobby, mumbling to himself. When officials tracked Robert down, they found a fire on him, which was illegal for him to have since he was a felon. Along with the weapon in his hotel room, police found Robert's birth certificate and passport, maps of Louisiana, Florida, and Cuba, a fake Texas ID, a flesh-colored latex mask, a few ounces of ganja, and $42,000 in cash. Just your everyday essentials, right? Oh, and after that, detectives found out Robert was awaiting the arrival of a package with a pair of shoes and $117,000 in cash that was mailed to him from a friend in New York. After their discoveries, investigators realized how lucky they were to have found Robert when they did. This time, it looked like he was leaving the country for good, and they knew that he probably planned to disappear forever. But dumb old Robert had to check his voicemail, and once again, thanks to an old person not understanding technology, the jig was up. Robert was initially arrested at the hotel for possession of a weapon, and he ended up pleading guilty and receiving an 85-month prison sentence. Robert's trial for Susan's slaying was supposed to begin in Los Angeles in 2016, but it was postponed due to a serious surgery that Robert needed. Instead, his conditional hearing happened in February of 2017, and his preliminary hearing was scheduled for October. One of Robert's closest friends said that Robert confessed to taking Susan's life one night in private and agreed to testify against him in the upcoming trial. But the hearing scheduled for October of 2017 had to be postponed again to 2018 after a lot of Robert's defense teams suffered damage to their homes and offices in Hurricane Harvey. Which, like, of course it's postponed. This guy's in his 70s now and has literally escaped imprisonment so many times that this just might as well happen for the 100th time. In his pretrial hearings, the prosecution brought in a bunch of older witnesses who gave extensive testimonies because at this point, the prosecutors were afraid they wouldn't have many living witnesses left by the time his official trial finally rolled around. Finally, in October of 2018, the LA County judge ruled that there was enough evidence to try Robert for Susan's case. Robert, of course, pled not guilty. And after a few more postponings, reschedulings, and legal issues were cleared up, the man who evaded punishment for 4 decades was set to stand on trial March 2nd, 2020. The trial was expected to take several months. Well, it was a nice thought. Because just 10 days after Robert took the stand, the COVID-19 lockdown began, and once again, Robert Durst's trial was postponed. His trial is now set for April 12th, 2021. So hopefully by the time this episode comes out, we will have seen Robert the Raisin take the stand and finally give his side to the sordid Susan saga. Honestly, I can't believe how long Robert was able to get away with what he did. But I guess when you're an eccentric billionaire, you can afford to live whatever kind of life you want, even if it's just a drag queen in tiny Texas beach town. Well, whether or not Robert will admit to his crimes is hard to say. But this time, I've got a really good feeling that he's going to get behind bars for a long, long time. So I would say that's a great reason to celebrate.